The Secret Science at Work by Max Freedom Long. Chapter 2, Getting Acquainted with the Low Self. We begin then, just as we did in the HRA, to try to discover all that we can about our low self. So let me just say here, HRA stands for Huna Research Associates. In using this term, it must be emphasized that it does not mean that the subconscious is low in an ignoble or degraded sense. It means simply that it is the lowest of the three selves in the scale of growth or evolution. The concept of unconscious mental activity was first explored in modern times by Sigmund Freud. To him and his followers we owe much, but he precipitated a real war. Even today, a few embattled and embittered psychologists are still holding out against his findings. To do so, they have been forced to fall back into behaviorism and to question the very nature of consciousness as something apart from the chemical processes of the body. Fortunately, the great majority of psychologists have accepted the subconscious, in brackets, our low self, as a fact and as a valuable discovery. For this reason, we need not pause to belabor the question as to whether or not the Kahunas were right in believing in a low self, nor need we go to great lengths to explain, as I did in The Secret Science Behind Miracles, the reasons for deciding that the low self is a separate entity and not a part of the middle self. The Kahunas, evidently, considered the low self something that must be understood at all costs. Their word for it, unihipili, used in Chapter 1 as an example of deriving the secret words from the small root words, contains still more meanings than were set forth there. They had an alternative word, unihipili, meaning the low self, which repeated some of the roots but contained others, providing additional meanings. Also, there are cross-reference words and symbols. The total of all these tells us the following things about the low self. 1. It is a separate and conscious spirit or entity, just as the middle self and the high self is. It is a lesser God in the making. Number 2, it is the servant of the other selves and is attached to the middle self as a younger brother and cleaves to it as if there were two parts of a thing which had been glued together. Number 3, the low self has control of all the various processes in the physical body and of everything but the Let me start the sentence again. Okay, number 3. The low self has control of all the various processes of the physical body and of everything but the voluntary muscles. In its aka body, aka body, it can slide into and out of the physical body. It is in the body as a pencil in a case. It impregnates every cell and tissue of the body and brain, and its aka body is a mold of every cell or tissue or fluid. Number 4, it and it alone is the seat of all the emotions. It is the one who sheds the tears. If one disbelieves this, let him try to shed tears of grief all by himself as a middle self and see how impossible it is. The tears will not flow until the emotion of grief has been aroused in the low self, in this case, by the middle self, with a special effort to think of sad things and cause the low self to recall them and live them over. Even this may not even bring tears. On the other hand, one may unexpectedly read or see something which touches the emotions, and the low self reacts of its own accord and embarrasses us by a sudden shedding of tears. Love, hate, and fear all come from the low self as emotions, and they may be so strong as they sweep away the will of the middle self and force it to join in the feeling of the emotion or in reacting to it. The understanding of this is important because we are often carried away by the emotions of the low self, and in this way are overpowered by it and led astray. The major job of the middle self is to learn to control the low self and to prevent it from running off with a man. Number 5, the low self manufactures all the vital force, or mana, M-A-N-A, for the use of the three selves. Normally, it shares the mana with the middle self, who can then use it as will, in quotes, W-I-L-L. Open bracket. Mana, divided or shared mana, close bracket. In making prayer, the low self contacts the high self by means of the aka cord, which it activates, and along which it sends a supply of mana to be used by the high self in answering our prayers. Number 6, the low self receives all sensory impressions through the organs of the 5 senses and presents them in the middle self for explanation. Number 7, the low self does the work of recording every impression and every thought. It may be said to make a tiny mold of the aka substance of its shadowy body, something after the manner in which we record sound on a photograph record, or words by writing them down on paper. All sounds, sights, words, thoughts, or words come in time trains or units, which contain many single impressions joined together. The kahunas symbolize these clusters of small round things, such as grapes or berries. Ordinarily, these microscopic clusters of invisible substance are carried in that part of the aka body of the low self which impregnates or identifies itself with the brain. But at the time of death, the low self in its aka body leaves the body and brain as a pencil is pulled from a sheath, and in doing so, takes with it the memories. Number 8, the low self responds swiftly to the command of the middle self in recalling often used memories, so that the impression given when we talk or write is that we of the middle self have all memories right in hand for use at all times. This is the ideal or normal condition in which the cooperation of the two selves is nearly perfect, when the high self can be included as a unit or full partner in acts which involve its help. All is well. If, on the other hand, the low self, for various reasons, is out of hand and the three selves cannot work smoothly together, trouble is sure to follow. Number 9, the low self is the one which can be influenced or controlled by mesmeric or hypnotic suggestions. It also plays a major part in implanting thought forms of ideas to be suggested to others in the aka body of the one willing to accept suggestion. Number 10, the low self has complete control of any use of the low mana or basic vital force, of any use of the aka substance of the shadowy body. Number 11, the low self may hold unrationalized ideas in its aka body as memory clusters, ideas which the middle self was not in condition to rationalize when formed. These can seldom be recalled by the middle self, which is unaware that they are there and so cannot ask for them to be sent up. As the low self reacts to these fixations or complexes so strongly that the middle self cannot control it, trouble comes from that direction. There are other things which are known of the low self and its proclivities, and these will be stressed as we come to them. But there is a point that needs to be brought up here and emphasized strongly. Modern psychologists, of whom Jung is a good example, have written repeatedly of how dismal and savage and wicked the low self or subconscious is. They tell of the experiences in psychoanalyzing people and of the shock and horror experienced by their patients upon having the subconscious dredged and its complexes and irrational urges and memories brought to light. Huna offers much to correct this one-sided and mistaken attitude. If we agree with the Kahunas that there is growth or evolution in the world, wherever there is any form of level of consciousness expressing itself in life, we must agree that the low self, like the middle self and the high self, has come up with an evolutionary process from lower levels. The low self form is the low self form of mentation. Mentation is very limited. The middle self has evolved to the place where its reasoning power is vastly superior, and the still more highly evolved mentation of the high self becomes, because it transcends both memory and reason, is almost beyond our comprehension in its nature. Let me read that last sentence again because it seems important. Okay, the middle self has evolved to the place where its reasoning power is vastly superior, and still more highly evolved mentation of the high self, because it transcends both memory and reason, is almost beyond our comprehension in its nature. By comparing the power of the more evolved animals, as for instance the domesticated cat or dog or horse, we see that the low self is not greatly superior to them in evolutionary progress. Like them, it observes and remembers and uses elementary reason. Like them, it feels emotions of love, grief, anger, and fear. In short, it is almost an animal itself, the human animal part of man, resident in a body just as are all animals, but with the advantage of having with it as a guest in the body, or as a companion after death when only the aka bodies are inhabited, the middle self, the reasoner, the wiser guide. From this point of view, the shuddering away from the dredging of the low self by some schools of analysis is the wrong attitude entirely. The low self still has many purely animal instincts and urges. We understand a savage when he does things that would revolt a civilized man. We understand a dog or cat when it pounces on a rat, kills it with savagery and satisfaction. If the primitive urges, or possibly race memories, as Jung supposes them to be, are discovered latent in the low self, or even slightly active, when we dredge deeply, that is no reason for condemning the low self in disgust. The task of the middle self is to teach and guide the low self, to bring it along in its evolutionary growth as rapidly as may be, and to help it be less animal and more human, just as the high self offers guidance and instruction, if we will accept it, as to who are middle selves, so that we may grow towards the next level of consciousness with its superior mentation. The worst and commonest mistake made by the middle self is to get down on all fours, so to speak, and share all the low self, animal savagery, and emotional conditions. This is all too often done, especially when the low self is badly out of hand because it's filled with complexes. But it is most emphatically not the normal thing to do. There is no sadder spectacle than that of a middle self forgetting its position as teacher and dignity of director and ruler of the low self, forgetting to the degree that the hates, fierce and savage angers, and abysmal fears of the low self are not only shared but are encouraged. One does not wallow with the low self, even if it is badly darkened within. One pulls it out of the mud, washes it clean, and teaches it how to act like a man. Our task as middle selves is primarily that of learning to work consciously and properly with both the low self and the high self. Everything that is said in the following pages is aimed at explaining how this is to be done. Never forget that the normal low self is dear and bright and loving and is endlessly faithful and willing and eager. If it is not, then it is part of our task to learn why, just as we would learn why a sick child is cross and stubborn and to correct matters. Getting acquainted with the low self can be getting acquainted with the low self can be a delightful occupation, as many HRAs discovered early in our work. We discussed the ways and means of getting acquainted in the early bulletins and fell into the habit of speaking of the low self as George. This name, of course, comes from this saying, "Let George do it," which is so well suited to the low self since it does at least 9/10 of the work of the physical man. However, like the old dog, it can be taught new tricks only by a persistent effort of the middle self. Many of us took to addressing our low selves as George or Georgette, only to discover that the low self has very definite ideas of who and what it is and what it prefers in the way of a name. But let me start more or less at the beginning and tell the story. It is greatly worthwhile because it will give the methods with which you, the reader, may wish to test in your own turn and put to good use. First, one must believe that there is a low self, that is really there to contact. Second, one sits down in a quiet place and invites the low self to make itself known. One may speak it aloud, and one should then wait patiently and watch and see what impressions come from the mind center which the two selves share. George may send you a thought of his own accord, or he may wait, not sure of what you want or are planning to do, and watch for some mental command which will instruct him as to his part of this new activity. It often pays to hold a long, one-sided conversation with George on the first sitting. Tell him you have decided that the pair of you should get better acquainted, and you should have fun learning to play games together. This may seem childish, but the low self is something like a very precious child. It can be whimsical, clever, obliging, willful, stubborn, or eager, according to its particular nature. No two are alike, and no two are alike any more than any two middle selves, and there is no knowing what one's individual low self is like until one takes the time to get acquainted. As a rule, nothing much happens at once, but with a little explanation, one of the new games can begin soon. The low self almost always likes games, and it likes the same games you do. Otherwise, you wouldn't like them. Suggest aloud to George that you will tell him what things are to be found in the memory trove, and he is to see how fast he can find them and bring them up to be enjoyed. A man can go back to a favorite childhood toy, such as a red wagon, and a woman to a favorite doll, or there may be other loved objects or perhaps games that were played. Select one or invite George to bring to mind the memory of one that he liked best. I did that myself in making my early tests. I suggested that we go back and try to remember the gift we liked best when our third Christmas came round. I was obediently given the memory picture of a toy mule that bobbed its head. I considered it interestingly and found that it still brought a little touch of pleasure after all these years. And while I waited, other memories, long forgotten, flooded my mind. There I was again, so small that I sat on a stool and used a kitchen chair for a desk while I carefully drew a picture. My sister, a little bit older than myself, was suddenly there beside me, directing my efforts. A warm, emotional glow crept in, and an almost breathless concentration as the drawing absorbed the little boy, who mysteriously seemed to be a little part of me. It was a strange sensation, a delightful one, and I did my best to show my appreciation and to share the pleasant emotions and the memory with my low self. It soon developed into a most gratifying experience. I had almost nothing at all to do but stand by and cheer and share and observe out of the corner of my eye, so to speak, just what George would bring up. The old room, which had been misty, was found little by little, a corner here, a bit of furniture there, and even though George tried and I waited, we could not find all of it. Then, with a rush, George began bringing his treasures to me, dusty with the passage of years, dim in parts, but alive and glowing with the emotions of pleasure and contentment, which they brought back to be shared and relived. There was the summer, all without warning, and we were wading in the little brook outside the kitchen door. In the brook was a little turtle, which we loved and admired, and best of all, there came my mother's call from her kitchen, and with it returned such a fragrance of fresh, hot doughnuts just off the stove that it fairly made my mouth water. I asked George, after a pause in which we enjoyed the doughnut fragrance and ate one to the last crumb, spicy and hot, whether he could find anything else that we had ever shared which was as good. That brought up a vivid picture of a still smaller boy, and together we stepped into it and took over. We were seated on a pile of books, on a high chair at my grandmother's table, and the surroundings were very new and strange and wonderful to me. I looked out the window, on the sill of which red geraniums were in bloom. There was a red and white checkered cloth on the table, and in my two hands, I held with great care, a glass goblet with round knobs on its sides and a long stem, and the taste of the rich milk reproduced itself vividly. I saw my grandfather's bearded face and the twinkle in his eyes. A day later, we communed together again, and for many days thereafter, we explored the mutual likes and dislikes, taking turns at deciding what we liked best and remembering it. We covered the things we did, the things we learned to make, the things we learned or did or failed to do at school, even the things we liked least to do. Step by step, we got acquainted. I found that my George was only slightly interested in certain things that I thought were most interesting. For instance, I thought it would be enjoyable to recall the look of the schoolroom in Wyoming where I had passed my 8th grade days, and to remember the way the teacher looked. George, however, took no joy in that year. Try as I would, I could not get him to find for us the slightest thing concerned with that school year. I still do not know where the room was or who the teacher may have been, though the grades before all that came back in fair detail, and also the grades on through high school, normal school, and into college. As soon as I can get around to it, I shall go into the matter of that blind spot in our mutual memories and see what George has buried there. It may be something very important. He may be hiding a choice fixation which focuses on that grade, or more probably on that teacher, whoever she may have been. My experience has not been unusual. Letters from HRAs rolled in telling me of blind spots in their memories and of odd little ways that they found to be part of their low self activities. It is surprising how rapidly one becomes aware, in a strange inward way, of the personality and there-ness of one's low self. A spirit of comradeship develops, and a new awareness that was never there before. And as one comes more and more to the full realization that George is the one who must set all emotions going to repeat themselves to match memories, one becomes progressively more able to detach oneself from these emotions and to look at them with keen interest while letting them vibrate and buzz and churn, no longer getting caught in their stream to be carried away. It is a very rewarding thing to become increasingly able to stand off and to be the severe judge when events agitate George. Moreover, if one stands apart and is not swept away by the emotional flood, one can give George a hand and pull him out of it quickly. The damaging worry streams that repeat themselves, often when there should be rest or sleep, are the hardest to learn to avoid as they come unexpectedly into flood. But with practice, they can be sidestepped, just as they start by providing George with a constructive line of thought as a substitute. As a matter of fact, most of us have found that it is not George alone who needs to be trained. It is also the middle self. And often the realization has been a shock when we have been brought face to face with the fact that we have been sitting idly most of our lives while we have let George run the show in any hit or miss way that he might choose. Once a fair start has been made in the direction of becoming acquainted with the low self, the next stage of training can be undertaken. Up to this point, we have had to be content with a mix of responses which George has given without our help, and those which have been pulled up partly or completely by our suggestion to him. What is needed now is a way to put George entirely on his own. The use of the pendulum has served this purpose. For our requirements, it is necessary only to find some small object which will serve as a weight. When swung from about 3 inches of thread or cord, preferably silk, the bob is the weight, as the weight is called, may be a large glass bead or a round button, small crystal such as is used in chandeliers, or any small object which can be strung on a thread. I have seen a finger ring used, also a cross on a fine chain. Hold the pendulum by the thread about 3 inches from the bob and ask George to use the involuntary muscles to make the pendulum swing as he wishes. Because the involuntary muscles are the ones being used, we have in this method a way of setting the low self free to make up its mind about what its answer is to a question, and then we'll make it known to the middle self by certain swings of the pendulum. A set of rules of the game, in brackets, called by the water downers a convention, end bracket, must be decided upon by the middle self and carefully explained to the low self so that George will show you how to respond correctly. These rules vary among dowsers and other operators of the pendulum. My personal convention is that a swing crosswise to the body means yes, and one back and forth from the body means no. A swing diagonal to the body indicates in doubt. A clockwise circling means good. A counterclockwise swing means bad. A right-handed person will hold the pendulum with the first 2 fingers and thumb of the right hand, the reverse for those who are left-handed. George will often understand better if a sheet of paper is taken, and 6-inch lines drawn upon it and marked to corresponding with the yes, no swing direction, and the diagonal and the circling directions being indicated by arrows for good and bad. Numbers can be expressed by the number of swings given in answer to a question. The pendulum is held so that it clears the paper. The elbow is kept from resting on the table in the preliminary trials, as this gives George more freedom with the arm. Later on, he will be able to swing the pendulum, while you make yourself more comfortable by supporting your arm with the elbow on the table. Great care must be taken not to swing the pendulum with the voluntary muscles. When ready, tell George to watch while you demonstrate how the game is to be played. Hold the pendulum over the paper and say, "This is what you do to say yes, this to say no," and so on. Swing the pendulum yourself with the voluntary muscles which are under your control, and show how it goes. George learns quickly, and unless he has a hindering reason, will join in the game at once. Now, stop swinging the pendulum yourself, but hold it suspended, ready to swing, and say to George, "Now, you try. Give me the swing for yes." Give him time, and if he cannot do it, demonstrate it again, or several times, or perhaps rest until later and do it all over again. You might also tell George that he is really a very important fellow, and that it is important that the two of you learn to converse in this way, so that he can give his own views as things come up. Only a few of the HRAs failed to get George to cooperate with the pendulum. On the contrary, some of the Georges were like playful kittens and had a fine time playing with the pendulum in circles and lines with no semblance of the proper movements for a conversation. In several instances, it was found that the object used in making the pendulum was disliked by the low self, and that by experimenting with several trinkets or small objects, one could be found which won the approval of the low self and was promptly set swinging. Often a heavier pendulum will work better. The identifying feature of this first test is that when the pendulum is swung by the low self alone, there is little or no sensation felt by the middle self. That is, no feeling that the middle self is in any measure swinging the pendulum. This is partly because the motion of the hand which starts the pendulum and keeps it swinging can be so slight as to be undetectable. The slightest impulse will build up the swing, and the automatic resistance of the hand to the momentum and gravity pull of the swinging bob will act as an amplifier, so that the more the swing is resisted, the wider the swing will become. It is seldom possible to know much about the personality of the low self until the pendulum comes into use and allows it to act on its own. One low self may be a very sedate and sober entity, another playful or wayward and hard to hold to any task. Remember that the variation is similar to that which may be observed in children. It is indeed much like getting acquainted with a child. Confidence is to be won, things of common interest to be found, and a bond of warm, confiding trust and friendship built up. Some low selves will respond to scolding. Others will sulk and refuse to obey. Many have to be coaxed, but usually the best way to get cooperation is through praise and love and quick forgiveness for failure to obey or cooperate. At this stage, and until one is sure that he has become well acquainted with his low self and its inclinations, we have found that it is well to go slowly, act circumspectly, and above all, avoid letting the feeling of impatience with the low self or with the entire training project get the upper hand. Let yourself, just for once, throw the pendulum aside and cry out in anger, "This thing won't work," or else my low self is a complete numbskull, and thereafter the low self may never respond or take kindly to the exercise, or as it is best to call it, the pendulum game. Reward is something used in training animals. It is also in use in training the low self. The reward may be praise each time the order is promptly obeyed, and if you have even used a tidbit of reward, the low self enjoys the nibble of something it likes. Of course, the middle self also enjoys the nibble, and the two working in the body as a close unit. As soon as the low self has learned how to use the pendulum and responds accurately when you ask for a swing in a specified direction, simple conversations can be commenced. You ask the questions and George answers with the pendulum. The questions must concern things which are sure the low self knows well and understands. Of course, you will both know the answers at first, and this enables you to check the accuracy of them. But judge the progress made. Soon the question can be shaped to ask George's opinion on simple matters, or to ask him to guess. You are not sure what time it is. Make a guess, as, say, 15 minutes after the hour. Then let him make his guess by giving the right number of swings to count out the minutes. Or you may suggest guesses for George, such as 12 minutes, and he can swing no until you hit upon the number that he chooses. Check the clock then and praise him if he's done right. Don't blame him if he's done wrong. George is a good hand at telling time, as those people know who never need an alarm clock and usually respond well to this exercise. So it's an excellent one with which to begin a practice session. Some Georges like to count and are expert at it. One HRA borrowed his wife's button box and would place a handful of buttons on the table, smooth them out, and both he and George would take turns estimating the number of buttons to spread in the spread. His George soon proved twice as fast and twice as accurate as he was at the game, and was warmly praised. If George makes no response to a question after a proper pause to give him a chance to answer, it will provide the opportunity to get better acquainted by asking a series of questions aimed at getting his reasons for not liking that particular question, or finding out why he did not answer it. He may, just at the time, have wearied of the game. If so, he will usually admit it when asked in a friendly manner. If wearied, George should be excused for that sitting and the regular activities of the day resumed. George is often very stubborn, sometimes moody, and sometimes impatient. Unless you happen to have him in a better control than most, do not try to force him at times when he does not wish to play. Also, you may have touched on a complex of some kind that has caused George to close the session, or to get the jitters, or to react in some physical way, which will easily be noticed in the bodily sensations or reactions. Unlike the game of recalling memories and living them again with their full emotional content, the pendulum game tends to cut the two selves apart so that emotions are shared less or not at all. It is well, however, to watch for any feeling of emotion which George may share with you, and if none comes, when questions are asked about people or things which you think should arouse low emotions, such as love, fear, or hate, be sure to ask questions as to what George's private reaction may be. Do you like Mr. Black? You may ask, and watch carefully for the answer. It may be of importance because the low self of Mr. Black is very apt to feel towards you and your low self very much as your low self does to his, which would cause the middle self of Mr. Black to feel the same way. If George has an unreasoning dislike for Mr. Black, he can often be talked out of it. It is worth trying, and the reward may be a helpful friend instead of a potential enemy. Above all, avoid as pestilence the temptation to ask George to predict future events, or to get in touch with the spirits of the departed and give messages from them through the pendulum. Such operations are dangerous as well as useless for the primary stage of training, and if indulged in at any stage of the work, come only in what may be called postgraduate work. This cannot be stressed too strongly. George is usually very obliging. He often wishes very much to favor you, and when you ask him a question concerning the future, or perhaps someone at a distance, reluctance may disappoint you. He will try to oblige in inventing the answer, and in almost any case he will give you the answer he thinks you expect, whether it be because of fear or hope. This effort to accommodate not only gives you false information upon which you may act unwisely, but has resulted many times in getting poor George or Georgette branded as a most unreliable low self and a liar of the first water. Moreover, once so disgraced and made ashamed, the low self may refuse entirely to continue the training and to learn to do his part expertly in making the Huna type of prayer, the prayer which can be made successfully only when all three selves are doing their allotted parts, from the beginning of the prayer to the providing of the materialized answer. And that concludes Chapter 2. Chapter 3 is called Developing the Latent Abilities of the Low Self. Wow, isn't this interesting? Okay, I hope you'll join me for Chapter 3. And if you haven't done so already, do subscribe. That way you'll get all the chapters of this marvelous book. And till soon.